The microphone was already in his hands when she took it away. He had been standing at the edge of the small raised platform near the head table, the kind of man who measures his words the way he measures wood, carefully, with intention, never wasting what matters. He had written his toast on an index card. He had practiced it 4 times in the truck on the way over, his lips moving quietly at red lights, his rough thumb smoothing the corner of the card until it went soft. He had worn the suit he bought for his wife's funeral 17 years ago, the one that still fit across the shoulders but pulled just slightly at the collar when he breathed deep. He had not complained about the seating. He had not said a word when a young man in a white catering shirt asked him, twice, whether he needed anything from the kitchen. He had simply folded his hands in his lap at the table near the back exit, the one beside the swinging service door, and he had waited. He waited 3 hours for this one moment. The room smelled of gardenias and warm candle wax, and the particular sweetness of a rented ballroom that has hosted 100 other people's best days. The chandelier threw soft gold light across 200 faces, all of them turned toward the platform, all of them holding their champagne glasses at that expectant angle. Vanessa stood beside her new husband in a dress that cost more than Reggie made in 3 months of retirement. Preston Coleridge stood with his hand at the small of her back, tall and satisfied, the way men look when they believe they have already won everything worth winning. Reggie cleared his throat. He said, "I just want to say a few words about my daughter." That was as far as he got. She stepped forward with a smile already assembled on her face and took the microphone from his hand the way you take a toy from a child, smoothly, without apology, with a little laugh that told the room this was normal, this was fine, this was just daddy being daddy. "We love you," she said into the microphone, looking not at him, but at the guests. At Preston's family seated at the front tables with their pressed linen and their quiet money. But nobody wants to hear another sad story tonight. The laughter that followed was not cruel. That was almost the worst part. It was the easy, relieved laughter of people who had been handed permission to move on. A few people near the back glanced at him with something soft in their eyes, pity, or its cousin, and then looked away, because that is what people do. The band started up again. The moment closed over itself like water. Reginald Alton Beaumont stepped down from the platform alone. He set the index card on the nearest table without reading it. He walked to the coat room, retrieved his jacket, and sat in his truck in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he drove home. The night air through the cracked windows smelled like cut grass and distant rain. His hands on the steering wheel were steady. He was 74 years old. He had buried a wife. He had raised a daughter on a teacher's salary and a prayer. He had never once asked her for anything. But something was coming. He didn't know it yet. He would. To understand what happened in that ballroom, you have to go back much further than the wedding. You have to go back to a red clay road in Bladen County, North Carolina in the early 1950s, where a boy named Reginald grew up in a house his grandfather had built from lumber cut off their own land. The house had 4 rooms and a tin roof that sang when it rained. And in the summers, the air inside smelled of pine resin and the particular sweetness of his mother's tea cakes cooling on a cloth by the window. They were not wealthy people. They were not people who talked about money at the table or measured their worth in acres or bank balances. They were people who fixed what broke, grew what they could, and understood without being told that dignity was something you carried inside you, not something other people granted you permission to have. His father, Clarence Alton Beaumont, was a man of very few words and very deliberate actions. He worked at the grain cooperative in Elizabethtown during the week and spent his weekends in a small outbuilding behind the house. surrounded by the organized smell of linseed oil and sawdust, restoring furniture that neighbors brought him in pieces. Reggie would sit on an overturned crate and watch his father's hands move across a damaged chair leg or a warped cabinet door with a patience that seemed to come from somewhere ancient. Clarence never explained what he was doing. He simply did it, and over time the boy understood that the explanation was in the doing. You learned by watching. You learned by being present. You learned that broken things were not the same as worthless things. His mother, Erline, taught third grade at the county school and sang in the church choir every Sunday with a voice that could silence a room without trying. She was a small woman with large opinions and an absolute refusal to let any of her 3 children feel sorry for themselves for longer than was reasonable. When Reggie was 8 and cried because the other boys had new bicycles and he did not, she sat him down at the kitchen table and said, with the calm directness that was her signature, "Reggie, self-pity is a room with no windows. Don't you move in there." He never forgot it. There were moments in his life, years later, when those words were the only furniture he had. He was the middle child, between an older sister named Gloria, who became a nurse in Fayetteville, and a younger brother, Dennis, who died of a fever at age 7 in the summer of 1961. That loss settled into the family like a stone dropped into still water. It changed the depth of everything without changing the surface. His parents did not fall apart. They grieved the way their generation grieved, quietly and in motion. And Reggie watched them choose to stay intact and understood that this too was a kind of instruction. He would need that lesson more than once. He was an unremarkable student in most subjects and an extraordinary one in shop class. His hands understood angles and grain and tension in ways his brain couldn't always articulate. By the time he was 16, he was refinishing furniture on his own commissions, earning small amounts of money that he saved in a coffee can under his bed. His shop teacher, a broad-shouldered man named Mr. Eustace Farrell, told him once that he had a gift for seeing what something could be rather than what it currently was. Reggie held that observation close for the rest of his life. He thought it was the truest thing anyone ever said about him. He went to Fayetteville State on a partial scholarship and a lot of determination, studied education, because he wanted to do for other kids what Mr. Farrell had done for him, and graduated in 1973 with a degree and a quiet certainty about the direction of his life. He returned to Bladen County and took a position teaching shop at Clarkton High School, and within 2 years he had turned a neglected half-functional workshop into the best vocational program in the district. Students who had never been told they were good at anything discovered in his classroom that their hands knew things their report cards didn't reflect. He never raised his voice. He never had to. There was an authority in his stillness that teenagers, for all their noise, seemed to recognize and respect. He met Loretta Jean Pridgeon at a church potluck in the fall of 1976. She had come with her cousin and brought a sweet potato pie that people were still talking about 2 years later. She was a tall woman with a gap between her front teeth and a laugh that started slow and then took over the whole room, and Reggie Beaumont, who had dated very little and talked about himself even less, found himself standing beside her at the dessert table for 45 minutes, telling her things he had never told anyone. She listened the way good listeners do, with her whole face, not just her ears. He drove home that night feeling like a window had been opened in a room that had been sealed for years. They married in June of 1978 in the same church where his mother sang. It was a small ceremony, practical and warm, with wildflowers from his mother's garden in mason jars along the pews, and a reception in the fellowship hall that smelled of fried chicken and floor wax and good perfume. He wore a suit he'd saved up for. She wore her grandmother's earrings. They danced to a song on a record player someone had wheeled in from the pastor's office. And when Loretta put her forehead against his shoulder, and he felt the full warm weight of her trusting him completely, he understood for the first time what it meant to be chosen. Not hired, not needed, not tolerated. Chosen, they built a life that was modest by most measures and rich by the ones that mattered. They rented a house on Mill Pond Road that suited them fine. Loretta worked as a bookkeeper for a local hardware supplier and kept their finances with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. Reggie taught his classes and ran his workshop, and in the evenings they ate supper together at a table he had built himself from reclaimed oak, and the house smelled of whatever Loretta was cooking and the faint ghost of linseed oil that never quite left his hands no matter how hard he scrubbed. Vanessa was born in 1987, and she was, from her first hours, a person of tremendous intensity. She cried with conviction. She laughed with her whole body. She wanted things completely or not at all. And she had her mother's gift for filling a room with her presence and her father's gift for seeing the value in what other people overlooked. As a little girl, she would follow Reggie into the workshop and sit on his workbench and ask questions in an unbroken stream. What is that for? Why does that work? What happens if you do it the other way? And he answered every question with the same patience his father had shown him. Those were the best hours of his week, those Saturday mornings with the workshop radio playing and his daughter's sneakers swinging against the bench edge and sawdust floating through the slant of light from the high window. Loretta was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2001. She was 47 years old. She fought it with the same direct, unsentimental courage she brought to everything, and she and Reggie did not waste the time they had left on grief they hadn't yet earned. They took a trip to the Outer Banks that summer, the three of them, and Vanessa was 14 and mostly embarrassed to be seen with her parents in public. But there was one evening when they sat on the beach after sunset, and Loretta held both their hands, and the ocean made its slow, patient sound, and none of them spoke. And Reggie knew that whatever came next, this moment was permanent. It belonged to them. It could not be taken. Loretta died in March of 2002. She was 48 years old. Reggie buried her on a cold Tuesday morning and went back to teaching on Thursday. Not because he was not devastated, because he had a daughter who was watching him to learn what devastation looked like and whether it was survivable. He needed her to see that it was. He raised Vanessa alone for the next 11 years. Through high school and then through college in Charlotte, where she studied business and discovered that she had a talent for money and a taste for a kind of life that was several tax brackets above the one she had grown up in. He was proud of her ambition. He sent her what he could. He never once made her feel that she owed him anything for it. He retired from Clarkton High School in 2018 after 35 years. The students and faculty gave him a small party. Someone made a sheet cake. He was given a plaque and a gift card to a hardware store, and he drove home with both of them on the passenger seat and sat in his driveway for a while before going inside to his quiet house and his workshop, where 3 pieces of furniture were waiting for him in various states of restoration. It was around that time that Vanessa began spending more time in Charlotte with a man named Preston Coleridge. And it was around that time, though Reggie could not have named it then, that the warmth in his daughter's voice when she called him began to cool by degrees so small he almost didn't notice. Almost, Preston Coleridge was the kind of man who made excellent first impressions. He was tall in the way that reads as capable, well-dressed in the way that reads as successful, and he spoke with the measured confidence of someone who had spent years in rooms where language was a tool for getting what you wanted rather than saying what you meant. When Vanessa first brought him to Clarkton for a Sunday dinner in the fall of 2019, Reggie cooked a pot roast and set the table with the good placemats Loretta had picked out. And Preston sat across from him and asked polite questions about furniture restoration and nodded at the answers with the attentive performance of a man who has learned that appearing interested costs nothing and buys considerable goodwill. Reggie noticed the performance. He said nothing. He had spent 35 years reading young people, and he knew the difference between genuine curiosity and social strategy. But Vanessa's eyes across the table were bright and hopeful in a way he hadn't seen in a long time, and he loved his daughter, and so he passed the bread and kept his observations to himself. The engagement was announced in early 2020. Reggie called Vanessa the evening he heard and told her he was happy for her and meant it as completely as he could, which was mostly, but not entirely. She thanked him in the brisk way she had developed for conversations with him warm enough to pass, brief enough to close. The wedding was set for October 2021 at a venue outside Charlotte that cost, as best Reggie could estimate from the invitation materials, more than he had earned in his last 4 years of teaching combined. He did not ask who was paying. He sent back his RSVP card and pressed his good suit and did not say a word. What he did not know in those early months was that Preston had already begun a quiet and methodical investigation into the real estate holdings and property records of Bladen and Brunswick counties in North Carolina. Preston's firm specialized in land acquisition, specifically in identifying parcels of riverfront and agricultural land whose ownership records were unclear, disputed, or simply neglected, acquiring them at low cost through legal maneuvering, and reselling them to developers at multiples that made the original transactions look almost embarrassingly small. He was good at it. He had an instinct for the overlooked, for the gap between what records showed and what reality held, and he had built a quiet reputation in certain Charlotte circles as someone who could find value in the places other people walked past without looking down. He had identified a parcel of 34 acres along a tributary of the Cape Fear River in Brunswick County as particularly promising. The land had remained undeveloped and largely invisible in public records for decades. The original deed, recorded in 1947, listed the owner as Alton C. Beaumont, a name that appeared nowhere in current county records as a living party, nowhere in probate filings, and nowhere in any title search his paralegal could trace forward through time. As far as Preston's research could determine, the land was effectively orphaned, its owner long dead, its heirs unidentified, its legal status quiet enough that with the right filing and the right timing, a claim of adverse possession or a quiet title action could be pursued through his shell company, Rivermark Holdings, ELC, without significant opposition. He had been working this angle for 18 months before he married Vanessa. He had never once connected the name Alton C. Beaumont to the quiet man with the calloused hands who passed the bread at Sunday dinner. The first concrete act of cruelty came before the wedding, though Reggie did not recognize it as cruelty at the time. In the spring of 2021, Vanessa called him on a Tuesday evening with a particular tone she used when she had already decided something and was informing rather than discussing. She told him that the seating for the reception had been finalized and that given the layout of the venue and the number of Preston's family members attending, it had made more sense to seat Reggie at one of the tables near the back. She said it quickly, with a small attached laugh that was meant to make it feel casual. She said Preston's parents and siblings needed to be near the front for the formal photographs. She said Reggie would still be able to see everything perfectly well. He held the phone against his ear and looked at the half-restored secretary desk in his workshop and said, "That's fine, honey. Because what else do you say?" Because she was his daughter, and he was not going to make her wedding about his feelings. But it wasn't fine. In part of him, the part that had spent a lifetime reading what people meant underneath what they said, knew that this small rearrangement was not about venue logistics. It was about which version of her father Preston's family would see. It was about distance. It was about the careful management of an embarrassment she had not yet named out loud, but had already decided he was. The second act came the week before the wedding, when Preston's mother, a woman named Carolyn Coleridge, who wore her money like a second skin, called Vanessa to discuss the rehearsal dinner seating and referred to Reggie. In a conversation Vanessa did not correct and did not report, but which reached Reggie 3 weeks later through his sister Gloria, as the handyman Vanessa grew up with. Gloria had been at a hair appointment in Fayetteville and overheard two women who knew the Coleridge family talking across the salon. She called Reggie on a Wednesday morning and told him what she'd heard in the careful, gentle way she had always delivered difficult information, and when she finished there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for both of them to feel its full weight. "Did Vanessa say anything to correct her?" Reggie asked. Gloria said, "Baby, I don't know." But they both knew. The silence already knew. He did not call Vanessa about it. He turned it over in his mind for several days, the way he turned a piece of damaged furniture, looking at it from every angle, trying to understand the nature of the break. He decided that perhaps Carolyn Coleridge had misspoken. He decided to give his daughter the benefit of the doubt she had not earned, but he was willing to extend anyway, because he was that kind of man, and she was his child, and the alternative was a grief he wasn't ready to carry. The wedding day arrived cool and gold-leafed, the kind of October morning that North Carolina occasionally produces like an apology for August. Reggie drove 2 hours to Charlotte in his truck, his index card in his breast pocket, his good suit brushed and pressed. He arrived at the venue and was directed by a coordinator with a clipboard to his table 14, near the service entrance, between a great aunt of Preston's who was hard of hearing and a college friend of Vanessa's who spent the entire reception on her phone. The floral centerpiece at his table was slightly smaller than the ones at the front. He noticed this the way he noticed everything, quietly, without comment. He sat through the ceremony in a white folding chair in the last row of the outdoor arrangement because by the time he arrived the front rows were full and no one had saved him a seat. He watched his daughter walk down an aisle lined with eucalyptus and candlelight, and she was beautiful. Genuinely and heartbreakingly beautiful, and he felt the full complicated weight of being a father in that moment, the pride and the love, and underneath it, like a low note you feel in your chest more than you hear, the recognition that she was walking toward a life that had already quietly decided where he fit in it. He ate his dinner. He drank 1 glass of wine. He waited. When the toast began, he stood and made his way to the platform with his index card, and someone handed him the microphone, and he held it with both hands and looked out at the room and found Vanessa's face among the 200, and what he saw there was not pride or anticipation or the soft openness of a daughter waiting to hear what her father had carried in his heart for 34 years. What he saw was alarm. And then her hand was on the microphone and her voice was in the room. and her laugh was releasing the crowd from any obligation to witness his feelings, and he was stepping down from the platform with the index card still in his hand. Unread, all those careful words folded back into his pocket like something that no longer had a place to go. The drive home took 2 hours. The radio played, and he did not hear it. The highway was dark and long, and the headlights found only what was immediately ahead, never further. He pulled into his driveway on Mill Pond Road and sat in the truck, and the night smelled of turned earth and coming rain and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, and Reginald Alton Beaumont, who had buried his brother and his wife and his career, and now apparently his standing in his own daughter's life, put his forehead against the steering wheel and allowed himself exactly the amount of grief that the moment required. Then he went inside. He did not sleep. By morning, he had decided that he would not call her. He would wait. He was good at waiting. He had learned it from his father, from a man who understood that the work you did in silence was often the work that lasted. He went to the workshop and picked up his tools, and the old secretary desk waited for him with its damaged base and its sealed compartments, and he began, slowly, to take it apart. He had no idea what he was about to find. It was a Tuesday morning in early December, 6 weeks after the wedding, and Reggie was doing what he always did when the world outside his workshop had become too large and too loud and too full of things he couldn't fix. He was fixing something else instead. The secretary desk had been sitting in the corner of the workshop since September when a woman named Mrs. Adele Fitch from 2 towns over had dropped it off in the bed of her son's pickup truck and explained that it had belonged to her husband's family for as long as anyone could remember, and she'd like it restored if possible, but understood if it was too far gone. Reggie had looked it over that afternoon and told her it wasn't too far gone. Nothing was ever too far gone if you were willing to be patient with it. Mrs. Fitch had smiled at that as though he'd said something she needed to hear, and driven away, and the desk had waited in the corner through September and October while he finished 2 other commissions and tried not to think about a white folding chair in the last row of an outdoor ceremony. It was a roll-top design, late 19th century by the look of the joinery, built from tiger maple that had gone dark and dull with age, but still held its figure in the right light, that wavering, almost liquid grain that good maple produces, visible only when the light hits it at an angle, like something hidden just below the surface trying to be seen. The roll-top mechanism was seized, and 2 of the small interior drawers had swollen shut with decades of humidity. The base cabinet, a double-doored lower section that sat beneath the writing surface, had a back panel that had warped away from its frame and was threatening to separate entirely. That was where he started on that Tuesday morning, kneeling on the concrete floor of his workshop with the smell of linseed oil and cold wood around him, and the small space heater in the corner ticking as it worked, pulling the base cabinet away from the desk body to assess the back panel damage. He worked carefully, the way his father had taught him. He removed the cabinet doors first, setting them against the workshop wall on a folded moving blanket so they wouldn't pick up grit from the floor. He pulled the 2 lower drawers and stacked them on his workbench. Then he reached into the cabinet with both hands to feel along the inside edges of the back panel, checking where the separation had begun, gauging how much the wood had moved, deciding whether it could be re-glued or needed to be replaced entirely. His right hand found the gap at the lower left corner of the back panel. He worked his fingers into it, applying gentle lateral pressure, and the panel flexed slightly more than he expected. He frowned and repositioned himself, pressing his cheek almost to the cabinet floor to look in at an angle. And in the thin beam of his work light, he saw something that made him go still. The back panel was not the original back panel. Someone had added a second layer. Behind the warped outer panel, set flush against the cabinet's actual back, was a thin sheet of 1/4-inch plywood that had been cut to fit with considerable skill, the kind of skill that meant whoever did it knew what they were doing and did not want it to be found. It had been in there long enough that the wood surfaces facing each other had bonded slightly with age and compression. And the gap he'd found was not the panel warping away from the frame. It was the false back beginning to separate from the real one. Reggie sat back on his heels and looked at the cabinet for a long moment. The workshop was quiet except for the heater and the distant sound of a truck on Mill Pond Road passing without slowing. He had found hidden compartments before secretaries and desks from the 19th and early 20th century sometimes had them, built by craftsmen who understood that people have always needed places to keep things they did not want found. But there was something about the quality of this concealment, the deliberateness of it, that made the back of his neck feel the way it felt before a storm. He got his thin pry bar from the pegboard above the workbench. He worked slowly. He did not want to damage whatever was behind the false panel, and he did not want to damage the panel itself until he understood what he was dealing with. He worked the pry bar into the gap with careful incremental pressure, moving along the bottom edge first, feeling the adhesion release in small stages with a soft crackling sound, like ice giving way at the edge of a pond in early spring. The smell that came out as the gap widened was the smell of serious time-old paper and closed air, and the particular dusty sweetness of wood that has been sealed away from oxygen for decades. It hit him in the face like something physical. The false panel came free. He set it aside on the moving blanket and aimed his work light into the space behind it. There was a 10-strong box. It was olive green, approximately 12 inches long and 8 inches wide and 4 inches deep, sitting flat against the cabinet's true back wall, as though it had been placed there with the same care and intention you'd use to set something down for the last time. The metal surface was filmed with dust and marked with the faint orange ghost of old rust along the seam of the lid, but the box itself was structurally intact. A small latch on the front, the kind with a simple rotary catch rather than a padlock, held the lid closed. Someone had wound a length of waxed twine around the box twice and tied it in a careful knot. The kind of knot his father had taught him, a knot that was meant to hold, but also meant to be opened again by the right person at the right time. Reggie's hands were not quite steady when he reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than he expected, not dramatically heavy, the weight of paper, of documents, of the specific density of things that have been important enough to be preserved. He carried it to his workbench and set it under the work light and stood looking at it with his hands at his sides. The wax twine had gone brittle with age, and when he touched it, it crumbled between his fingers rather than untied, leaving a faint waxy residue on his thumbs. He set the pieces aside. His hand went to the latch and stopped there. He has thought about this moment since, and what he remembers most is not the excitement he might have expected to feel or the curiosity, but something older and quieter than both of those things, a sensation like standing at a threshold, like the particular stillness of the moment before you open a door into a room you have never entered and cannot yet know the dimensions of. His heart was beating in a way he could feel in his fingertips. The heater clicked. Outside, a bird called once and went silent. He opened the box. The lid resisted slightly, the rust along the seam acting as a weak seal, and then released with a soft exhalation of old air that he felt on his face, cool and stale, and carrying that deep paper smell, concentrated now, intimate, like breath. Inside, a piece of folded cloth, an old cotton handkerchief, yellowed but intact, had been laid across the top of the contents as a kind of padding or protection, the same way you'd wrap something fragile. He lifted it carefully with 2 fingers and set it beside the box. Beneath it, a small stack of documents, folded and refolded over decades into a compact rectangle, held together by a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity and was simply lying in place out of habit. A photograph, face down, paper clipped to the outside of the folded stack. 2 envelopes, sealed. One addressed in a handwriting he didn't recognize, and one in a handwriting he recognized immediately with a jolt that started in his stomach and moved upward through his chest. The second envelope was addressed in his father's handwriting. Clarence Alton Beaumont had died in 1991. Reggie had not seen his father's handwriting in over 30 years. But a person's handwriting is as individual as their voice, and you do not forget the voice of the man who taught you everything you know about patience and wood and the dignity of quiet work. And Reggie stood at his workbench in the cold December morning of his workshop and looked at his father's handwriting on an envelope that had been sealed inside a tin box behind a false panel in the base of a cabinet for God only knew how long. And his eyes filled with tears before he had read a single word. He did not open the envelope first. He made himself go in order. He set the envelope gently to the side and picked up the folded document stack and worked the dead rubber band off without breaking it and unfolded the papers on the workbench surface with the slow care of someone handling something that might not survive rough handling. The first document was a carbon copy of a survey map, hand-drawn and annotated, showing a parcel of land along what was labeled as the Lockwood Folly Tributary in Brunswick County, North Carolina. The parcel was marked in the careful strokes of a surveyor's pen with its boundary lines and dimensions. In the lower right corner, in the formal notation style of mid-century land records, the acreage was listed, 34.2 acres, the date of survey, April 1947. His hands were trembling now. The second document was the deed itself, a full legal instrument on the heavy cream paper that property records of that era used, folded to the size of a letter and now unfolded across his workbench to its full dimensions. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly, the way they had moved on the index card in the truck on the way to the wedding. The legal description of the property, the county, the boundaries. The consideration paid $420, which in 1947 was not a small sum for a man of his father's means, and which told Reggie without any other explanation that this land had mattered, that his father had chosen it deliberately, had saved for it, had wanted it badly enough to spend real money and then seal the evidence of its existence behind a false panel and a piece of furniture. The name on the deed, Alton C. Beaumont, not Clarence, not C. Alton, Alton C. His father's middle name first, the name he never used publicly, the name so private that even some members of the family had not known it. The name he had given his son as a middle name, a quiet inheritance, a signature passed forward through blood, Reginald Alton Beaumont. Named for his father's hidden name, a connection that existed only if you knew where to look, only if you knew the family from the inside. Reggie set the deed down on the workbench and stood in his workshop in the December morning, and the weight of what he was holding settled into him in stages, like water finding its level. His father had owned 34 acres of riverfront land in Brunswick County, had owned it outright, paid for it in 1947, recorded it in his middle name. And then, for reasons Reggie could not yet know, but would come to understand had sealed the deed and the documentation inside a strong box behind a false panel and a piece of furniture that had spent decades passing through other people's hands until it landed in September of a year when Reggie needed it most, in the corner of his workshop on Mill Pond Road. He picked up his father's envelope. He opened it with the small folding knife he kept on the workbench, slitting the seal carefully, and removed a single sheet of paper covered on both sides in his father's deliberate, unhurried hand. He read it standing up, and then he read it again, sitting on his stool, and then he set it flat on the workbench and pressed both palms against it as though he could absorb it through his skin. His father had written, "Reggie, if you have found this, then the desk found its way to you, which means it was meant to. This land is yours by right and by blood. I bought it with the intention of building something on it for the family, but times changed, and I never did what I meant to do with it, and I was afraid of what the legal complications might bring to your mother if I died without settling it properly. I was going to handle it. I kept putting it off. That was my failure, and I am sorry for it. The deed is recorded in my name, my real name, the one I gave you. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't belong to you. It does. It always did. Take care of it the way you take care of everything. I am proud of you, son. I always was." The letter was dated October 1989. His father had written it 2 years before he died and sealed it in this box and hidden it in this desk, and the desk had traveled through estate, sales and storage units and secondhand shops, and one woman's spare room in Columbus County for 30 years before a woman named Adele Fitch's. Son loaded it into a pickup truck and brought it to a workshop on Mill Pond Road, where a retired shop teacher was kneeling on the floor trying to fix a warped back panel. Reginald Alton Beaumont put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a long time. When he finally lifted his head, the winter light through the workshop's high window had shifted, and the tiger maple of the secretary desk caught it at a new angle, and all that hidden grain that had been invisible a moment ago blazed suddenly across the surface that deep, wavering figure in the wood. Alive and unmistakable, the thing that had been there all along, waiting only for the light to find it. He knew exactly what he had to do. He did not call anyone that night. He sat at the kitchen table where Loretta's placemat still lay, and he read his father's letter 3 more times, and then folded it back into the envelope with the precision of a man who understands that some things deserve to be handled as though they matter, because they do. He made himself a cup of coffee he didn't drink and sat with the tin strongbox open in front of him and the deed laid flat under the kitchen light, and he looked at it for a long time the way he looked at a piece of damaged furniture before he began studying the full dimensions of what he was working with, understanding the grain of it, deciding where to start. He started with a phone call to his sister Gloria. He called her at 8 the next morning and told her everything in the orderly sequence of a man who has spent a night organizing his thoughts into something he can carry without dropping. Gloria listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and told him she understood the weight of what he was saying. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Daddy always said that land was going to mean something someday. I thought he was just talking." Her voice had the particular texture of a person trying not to cry while refusing to cry. Reggie told her he was going to need a good attorney. Gloria told him she knew exactly who to call. The attorney's name was Darnell Okafor, and he operated out of a modest office in Wilmington that smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee, and the specific organized confidence of a man who has spent 20 years untangling exactly the kinds of property disputes that other lawyers find too complicated or too unglamorous to bother with. He was in his mid-50s, compact and deliberate, with reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead until he needed them, and then deployed with a swiftness that meant business. Gloria had used him to settle their mother's estate in 2004 and trusted him completely. Reggie drove to Wilmington on a Thursday morning with the 10-strong box on the passenger seat beside him. Buckled in with the seatbelt the way you'd secure something irreplaceable, which it was. He laid everything out on Darnell Okafor's desk: the deed, the survey map, the letter, the photograph, the first sealed envelope, whose contents turned out to be a receipt from the Brunswick County Register of Deeds confirming the original recording, and watched the attorney go through each item with the unhurried attention of someone who has learned that speed and accuracy are rarely the same thing. Darnell looked up after 20 minutes and said, "Mr. Beaumont, this deed is valid. It was recorded correctly in 1947 under your father's legal name, which I can confirm matches the name on his birth certificate as his given middle name used as a first name, a common practice in that era, particularly in this region. The property was never transferred, never probated because no one filed to probate it, and never adversely possessed because it was never occupied or claimed by anyone else. As of this moment, as your father's surviving heir and the holder of the original recorded deed, you have an extraordinarily strong claim to this property." He paused and looked at Reggie over the top of his reading glasses, which he had deployed for the occasion. "Do you have any idea what this land is currently worth?" Reggie said he did not. Darnell told him. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was the longest Reggie had been speechless since the morning Loretta died. 34 acres of riverfront land along a Brunswick County tributary in a corridor that had seen significant coastal development pressure over the preceding decade had been appraised in a recent adjacent sale at values ranging between $12,000 and $18,000 per acre, depending on access and elevation. The parcel his father had bought for $420 in 1947 was, at conservative estimate, worth somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000. At current market, possibly more. Darnell filed the heirship affidavit and the chain of title documentation with the Brunswick County Register of Deeds on a Friday afternoon in the second week of December. The filing was a matter of public record. It was also, as these things occasionally are in small counties where the real estate community pays close attention to title activity, noticed almost immediately by someone who had been watching that particular parcel with considerable professional interest for the better part of 2 years. Preston Coleridge received the notification through his paralegal on a Monday morning. Reggie was in his workshop sanding the secretary desk's roll-top slats when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw Vanessa's name and set down his sandpaper and answered. She did not begin with hello. She said, "Daddy, what is going on with some property in Brunswick County?" Her voice had a quality he had not heard in it before. Not quite anger, not quite fear, but the tightly controlled register of someone who has just been informed that the ground beneath a plan they believed was solid has turned out to be something else entirely. Reggie said, "I found a deed that belonged to your grandfather." There was a pause. Preston says his company has been working on acquiring that land for over a year. He says there must be some mistake. Reggie said, "There's no mistake, honey." Another pause, longer this time. He could hear her breathing, and behind it the ambient sound of the Charlotte apartment, the particular acoustic signature of a space that costs more per month than his truck. Then, in a voice that had dropped half a register and shed most of its control, she said, Why didn't you ever say anything about this land? I didn't know about it until last week, he said. I found it in a piece of furniture I was restoring. He let that sit for a moment. Your grandfather left it for us, Vanessa, for the family. He just didn't get around to telling anyone where he'd put the paperwork. The silence on the line was so complete he could hear the small sounds of his own workshop, the heater, the sanding dust settling, the creak of the building in the December wind. And then Vanessa said, quietly, in a voice that had briefly lost its Charlotte polish and sounded instead like a 14-year-old girl sitting on a beach in the Outer Banks at sunset, holding her father's hand, "I'm sorry, Daddy, about the wedding, about all of it." He accepted the apology the way he accepted most difficult things, simply, without making her pay for it twice. He said, "I know you are." And he meant it. Preston's reaction was not so quiet. Darnell Okafor received a call from Preston's firm the following day, a call that began with the suggestion that the airship filing might be contestable and ended after Darnell laid out the complete chain of evidence with the calm efficiency of a man who has been doing this for 20 years and has heard every version of this particular argument, with the distinct sound of a door closing at the other end of the line. 3 weeks later, Rivermark Holdings LLC quietly withdrew its quiet title action on the Brunswick County parcel. The withdrawal was filed without explanation, as these things often are when the explanation is too embarrassing to commit to paper. Preston did not call Reggie. Reggie did not expect him to. What Darnell did recommend, and what Reggie spent January and February thinking about carefully, was not a sale, not immediately, not yet, but a visit. He had not seen the land. He had studied the survey map until he could close his eyes and trace the boundary lines from memory, had read the property description until he knew every compass bearing and distance measurement. But he had not stood on it, had not felt it under his feet, had not heard what the river sounded like from those 34 acres that his father had bought with $420, and a vision he had never gotten around to building. He drove down on a Saturday morning in early March when the light comes back to North Carolina with a particular quality not warm yet, but honest. The sky a pale, clear blue that makes everything beneath it look precisely itself. He took Highway 17 south from Wilmington, and then smaller roads that required the map on his phone because they had no useful signage, and then a dirt track through a stand of loblolly pines that opened without warning into a clearing at the edge of the water. He got out of the truck and stood in the clearing, and the air smelled of salt and pine and the dark organic richness of river mud, and the water moved past the bank with a low, steady sound like something breathing. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows 30 feet away and regarded him with the absolute indifference of a creature that has been here longer than any human claim on this land. The March wind came off the water, cold and clean, and Reggie turned his face into it and closed his eyes. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked the boundary lines, the way the survey map had described them, all 34 acres of it, through the pines and along the water's edge and across a low ridge in the eastern corner, where the land rose just enough to give a view south over the river and the marshland beyond. The ground was soft in places and firm in others, and the loblollies made their slow sound overhead, and somewhere in the brush a woodpecker was working at a dead snag with metronomic persistence. He stopped at the top of the ridge and looked south over the water and thought about his father. About a man who had driven down this same road in 1947 with $420 saved from grain cooperative wages and a vision of something he wanted to build for the people he loved, and who had recorded the deed in his middle name for reasons Reggie would never fully know: privacy, perhaps, or caution, or simply the habit of a man who had learned that some things were safer kept close, and who had sealed it in a box and hidden it in a desk and written a letter to a son he trusted to find it eventually. He had found it. He pulled out his phone and called Darnell Okafor and told him he was standing on the land and it was real, and he was ready to talk about next steps. Darnell said he had already received 2 inquiries from developers in the past 3 weeks, and that Reggie should take his time, that the land wasn't going anywhere, that it had waited this long and it could wait as long as he needed it to. Reggie said he appreciated that. He stood on the ridge a little longer. The heron lifted from the shallows below with a slow, enormous grace and crossed the river and disappeared into the tree line on the opposite bank. By April, Reggie had contracted with a local builder to clear a modest site on the ridge where the view was best, and by late May, the foundation of a small house had been poured. Not large, not expensive, not anything that needed to impress anyone. A place with a porch that faced south over the water. A place with a workshop out back, detached, with good north light and room enough for the work he intended to keep doing for as long as his hands would let him. He brought the restored secretary desk with him when he moved in early June. He set it in the corner of the small front room where the morning light would find it. And when the sun came through the east window and caught the tiger maple at the right angle, all that hidden grain blazed across the surface the way it had in his workshop on that December morning when everything changed. He made a cup of coffee and sat in the chair he'd built from reclaimed oak and looked at the desk and the light and the water beyond the porch railing. And the morning was very quiet and entirely his own. On a Thursday morning in late September, Reginald Alton Beaumont woke before sunrise the way he always did, put on his coffee, and walked out onto the porch in his work boots and an old flannel shirt that had gone soft at the elbows with years of use. The river was still in the early dark, a flat pewter mirror holding the last of the night sky. And the loblollies along the bank stood in their quiet rows like people who have learned that silence is its own kind of statement. A whippoorwill called from somewhere in the pines. The coffee steamed in his hand. He stood there the way a man stands when he has finally arrived somewhere and knows it not with triumph, not with noise, but with the deep, unhurried stillness of someone who has stopped running from something and started simply being somewhere. This was his life now, this ordinary, specific, unrepeatable life. He spent his mornings in the workshop behind the house where 3 pieces of furniture waited for him in various stages of becoming themselves again a Victorian parlor chair with a cracked rear leg. A blanket chest whose hinges had given way, a small writing table whose surface had been damaged by water and neglect, and the particular carelessness of people who do not know what they have. He worked the way his father had worked, without hurry, with the radio playing low, with the smell of linseed oil and fresh sawdust around him, like something familiar and permanent. In the afternoons, he walked the land, learning it the way you learn a person slowly, by paying attention, by showing up again and again until the thing reveals itself to you. Vanessa had come down twice since March. The first visit had been careful and slightly formal, the 2 of them moving around each other with the particular delicacy of people who have broken something and are not yet sure how much of it can be repaired. The second visit had been easier. She had sat on the porch in the evening and watched the river and said almost nothing for a long time. And in that silence, something between them had begun, quietly, to mend. Preston had not come. Reggie had not asked about him. Some things resolved themselves in their own time, and some things simply resolved themselves into a different shape than you expected, and you learn to recognize the difference. He thought sometimes about the wedding, about the white folding chair in the last row, about the index card in his breast pocket, about the moment the microphone was lifted from his hands in front of 200 people who looked away because looking away was easier. He thought about it not with bitterness, but with the clear-eyed recognition of a man who has spent a lifetime understanding that damaged things reveal their true grain when you take them apart carefully and look at what's underneath. The humiliation of that evening had sent him home to his workshop. The workshop had given him the desk. The desk had given him the box. The box had given him his father's voice across 30 years of silence, and his father's voice had given him this porch, this river, this morning, this life. Nothing was wasted, not even the pain. Especially not the pain. There is something in this story that belongs to all of us, not the specific geography of it, not the Brunswick County deed, or the tiger maple desk, or the 10-strong box with its waxed twine, but the deeper truth underneath all of those particulars. The truth that the things most worth having are sometimes the things sealed away in places we haven't thought to look. That the people who underestimate us are occasionally doing us the accidental kindness of sending us back to ourselves. That a life is not over when it is humiliated or diminished or pushed to the back of the room. A life is over when the person living it decides it is. And Reginald Beaumont had never made that decision, not when he lost his brother, not when he lost his wife. Not when he stood alone in a parking lot in October with an unread index card in his pocket and the sound of easy laughter still in his ears. He had gone back to his workshop. He had picked up his tools. He had kept going. Think of someone in your own life who has been pushed to the back of the room. Think of someone who has been told, in words or in actions or in the careful architecture of a seating chart, that their story is not worth hearing. Think about whether you have told them lately that you see them, that their life is not too far gone, that the grain is still there, hidden, waiting only for the light to find it at the right angle. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because every week we bring you stories that remind us that even in the darkest moments, something extraordinary may still be waiting.